ask that everyone turn off their camera and their microphone as well. And then at the end, we can have a full discussion about the topic. But feel free to post comments and questions in the chat throughout the presentation, because I know I'm very forgetful and I have a question, and then if I don't write it down, I'll forget to ask. And then at the end, I can look at the chat and we can have an open discussion. If we go over the time, because I know this is scheduled until 5 o'clock, that's okay as well. I am the last panel of the day, so we can keep talking about princesses and everything as long as you'd like. So let's get started.
I'm unmute myself first. Should you make me host again and then I make
host? Yes, so sorry. Okay. Let me make you a host. And I gotta make me co-host. I love technical stuff. Okay, wonderful. So let's get started. So my panel presentation is called Someday My Prince Will Come, A Tale as Old as Time. And so we're gonna go into a dive into Disney princesses. So a little bit about me. I've actually been a character performer since 2015. So a character performer is different from a cosplayer, actually, which is what a term most people are familiar with. So with a cosplayer, the term comes from costume role player. So a cosplayer is like you dress up as certain characters, whether it's video game or anime, and then you act similar to how that character would act, which is what a character performer does, but it's on a whole new level in a way where everything you do, you always stay in that character, and you basically literally bring those characters to life. And most character performers actually work most of the time with children or things like that to keep that fantasy alive and to allow children to believe in that illusion as much as possible. So I used to freelance and do birthday parties. I used to do a lot of like side events. At one point, I actually worked in a carnival, which was my worst hiring experience ever. Story for another time, but do not be a character performer for a carnival because you will hate like everything about it. So after doing that for a little bit, getting my like toes wet and doing all these different types of characters, which were mostly Disney princesses, I then created my own volunteer group called Heroes for Hire New England in 2018. And so basically it's a volunteer group where we dress up as Power Rangers, we do Star Wars characters, we do princesses, mostly superheroes, which is why you're heroes in the name. And we work with shelter families, we work with charities, we work in community events, we do a lot of public events. And so basically the whole point of the group is we don't get paid. Everything we do is volunteer, but we wanted to make character performances more accessible to especially children who really needed it the most, whether they need an inspirational message or their parents could not afford to have birthday parties for children or hire character performers because it is expensive. A lot of character performer rates can go up to $125 an hour. So as you can imagine, for some families who can't even afford to have a standard birthday party, they really appreciated us coming in and trying to make that day magical, whether it's because the child was going through an emotional experience or they just really needed that uplifting message. So I started doing that. I actually traded my corset for a cape, and I still do princess performances. And I still do princess gigs as well. This is actually the character I mostly do now. If you don't know what it is, it's Sophia the First, which is popular on Disney Junior right now. But I do like playing Supergirl a lot more. There's not a lot of female heroes available, kind of like on the market, which is why I took on that role. But I still do princesses to teach like STEM, for example, because I've noticed that a lot of girls did not feel comfortable participating in science workshops and getting involved. They were more on the sidelines. And so when they started seeing like a princess do it, my main one was Snow White, and my story was that I wanted to learn chemistry after my evil stepmother poisoned me with an apple. They thought it was like super funny, and they're like, oh, I didn't know princesses knew science as well. So that's usually where I do my princess work as well. So if you ever want to learn how to do corporate science curricular to like with characters, I actually do help adapt that as well. And so following up to my next point, I have a degree in biology, but the reason why I'm doing this presentation is I actually wrote a Disney princess essay for a graduation requirement. So my school did this where every student had to write a non-STEM academic paper. And I really didn't want to write this paper because I had a lot on my plate already. So I decided that I wanted to be a smart aleck and make the most educated essay ever about Disney princesses, and then have them read the entire essay and do all this research and prove that like something like fandoms can be an actual educational and intellectual topic for conversation. And also I speak really fast, so let me know if you need me to slow down as well. So huge disclaimers about this presentation. Some of them are facts. Some of them are history, and that is accurate. Some of them are science papers that are out right now with numbers and everything, but some points are my interpretation. So you can feel free to disagree as well. Sorry, I don't know. I went to read something. But you can feel free to disagree, and at the end we can have more of a conversation on that. Another thing too is I am not trying to ruin your childhood or anything with this whole discussion. I love Disney. Clearly I am here with a tiara and a purple dress, and my room looks like it's Disney World. So I still love Disney. I just acknowledge that some things may not be represented in the best light, but I still like the creativity and everything about it. And this presentation will be focusing on the official princess franchise line from Snow White to Princess Tiana, mainly with like a focus on how those characters affect the female identity. I know there's a lot of culture that plays with some characters, especially in the later end of the lineup that I have. And so I will explain how these characters are represented and what that talks about the culture to viewers, but I'm not going to go into a full cultural lesson like this is what Native American tribe of Pocahontas was like or anything like that. If that's something that you're interested in because you really want to learn about the real facts of Pocahontas, I did do that research as well, and I can go into that for a future topic, but I just wanted to do like a broad overview of just like the female identity. So a little bit about Disney. It's actually a $22 billion empire. It is very large, has a lot of money, and actually Disney Princesses is the largest moneymaker and the largest, fastest growing girls franchise in the world. So this just shows how much influence Disney princesses have, just not in the US scale, but just in the entire world in general. So whatever ideas or however these characters are represented, that is not teaching the entire world, like this ideology as well. So this is something that we should definitely look more into focus. And it has strong nostalgia. It's been around for decades. And I feel like nostalgia can make it easy to overlook some of the outdated messages in Disney, just because you're like, oh, I love it. Like, I love it. I watched it growing up as a kid. Everything is fine. Everything about it is perfectly okay. And we need to be very careful of that attitude, because even though it is something we grew up with a childhood, doesn't mean that it's 100% okay. And so there's one research study that was done by Tobin and colleagues. It actually analyzed 26 Disney films, the classic films like Dumbo, Tarzan, a lot of films in the 90s, early 2000s, and some dating back earlier than that, on films of gender, race, and culture. And so they found that out of those 26 films, 15 films had women's appearance that was valued more than her intellect. 11 of those movies, women were helpless and in need of protection. 15 of those movies, women are domestic, which means that they did like household chores, taking care of others, being very maternal. 4 of those movies, which is basically anytime there was an overweight woman, they were villains. And 15 movies, men swoon over beauty, and there is love at first sight. And 19 movies, men were the heroes. So you can see that it's not just a couple of films, it's kind of a trend. that is going on with Disney. And so this is just overall all the Disney classic films, which I think is a good stepping place into what we're going to dive into, which is the Disney princesses specifically. And so here's my princess lineup, just in case you're unfamiliar with who are the princesses between Snow White and Tiana. So you have Snow White, Cinderella, Aurora, Ariel, Belle, Jasmine, Pocahontas, Mulan, and Princess Tiana. So there were, oh, okay, my screen stopped. And there were some princesses who were added to the lineup and then were later removed. We can talk about that at the end, like Esmeralda and Tinkerbell, but I just did what was the lineup right now as of this moment according to Disney. So the first era we're going to go in, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar, but Disney films are actually classified based on different ages and era. It's usually roughly a decade, but it varies. And so we have the Golden Age film series, which is from 1937 to 1942. So a little bit about this time period, about the 1930s, which is always important to know the historical context of when these films came out, because it actually lets you appreciate why certain themes were in those films that came out that year. Because like anything, everything gets influenced by the culture and society around them. And I think it's also really helpful to know that because it actually enriches the movie experience in the film, in my opinion anyway. And so before the 1930s, women actually entered the workforce for the very first time in the United States because of World War I. And during the Roaring 20s, there was just this huge uproar of just women freedom, for example, like sexual freedom. Contraceptives were widespread. Women could actually engage in sexual activity without the fear of pregnancy for basically the first time. And there's actually more relaxed clothing, which is the loose fit, not as tight, and they were showing a little bit more skin than beforehand. And then the 1930s came, which is when the Great Depression came, and it was like everything just backtracked for women, basically. There was fewer jobs available because men were coming back from the war, and so employers were actually prefer hiring men over women. And so women just had to return to a life of motherhood and taking care of children and taking care of the household again. And so they're basically back in that repressed role. And so the only workplace where women really thrived more than men was actually in the film industry. Most films that did have women actresses were focused on plots where the women just stayed at home and they were married and they were happy ending and they found that very successful man who took care of them. And so one famous film actress during that time was Claudette Colbert, which is in this image right here on the right. And who does she remind us of? Does anyone guess? Oh, Snow White. She had the same hairstyle. Actually, fun fact, Snow White is the only princess who actually has short hair throughout her entire film. So Mulan and Rapunzel had short hair towards the end of their films because they cut it off, but they did have long hair. Snow White is the only one who only has short hair, and that's just representative of the style of the time period, the 1930s. And so she was in the film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, and she was the first Disney princess. And so just a little bit more about Snow White. She's just a flat character stuck in a traditional film role. She's just known for her domestic skills and beauty, and she needed a male figure for her true happiness at the end, who only fell in love with her because of her beauty. Like, they didn't really have much of a conversation or any development except in the beginning when they sang a song at a wishing well. And then when she did take independent action for one time in the entire film, she suffered consequences. She chose to eat the apple, was poisoned, and then needed a man to help her at the end, which just shows how if you basically sending a message that if you try to do something for yourself, you will mess up, and then a man needs to come and help you, because then she put herself in an eternal sleep, and then she needed Prince Charming to help her. But basically, it was the highest grossing animated film, and it grossed $8 million in its initial release, more than any film before it. And it was so successful that it caused Disney to produce more feature film productions, because they were like, here's our first film. We made all this money. Everyone loves this idea of Snow White. She's just like that perfect like Hollywood actress, but in an animated version. And so these profits financed a $4.5 million studio in Burbank, which is still being used today as a production studio for Disney. So it just shows how legendary that this classic film was. And basically, this led to the Silver Age, which was from 1950 to 1967. And this is when we have Cinderella and Aurora. Cinderella is from the film Cinderella, and Aurora is from Sleeping Beauty. And so I call them the carbon copies because they are exactly like Snow White, with very little difference in that regard. Both of them are flat characters stuck in that traditional female role. They're characterized by their domestic skills and beauty. And they needed a male figure for true happiness at the end, who only fell in love with them because of their beauty, basically. Like, they didn't have much dialogue going on. And Aurora is even more like Snow White because when she did take independent action, she again suffered consequences, went into eternal sleep because she went out of her way to touch a spindle even though people were telling her not to and they were restricting her on purpose. And she wanted to step beyond that boundary and was poisoned and again needed a prince to come and help her. So there seems to be some type of formula here for what is the perfect princess, and that's basically there's a handsome prince, you do housework, you're beautiful, and you are a money-making movie. Just amazing. Like, we don't need to change anything about it. And then another caveat that I really want to dive into, that is something that I was a little bit observant of, and I noticed other people notice this as well. There is this whole theme in those three movies where white is wholesome and black is bad. And I mean this in that it is even said specifically where Snow White's skin is pure as white, pure as snow, pale, beautiful, and all that jazz. And even in the imagery, you see Snow White right here, and she is more like brightly colored, lighter color scheme. And then you see the evil, her evil stepmother on the side, and it's all covered in black. And Maleficent is all covered in a black cloak. So all of the villains literally were a black, like, massive thing that covered the screen. And even their scenery around them were also really dark as well. And so basically, this is teaching kids to associate white with good and black with evil. And it was just characterized throughout the whole film. And even though the setting, some people might argue, it's like, oh, well, they're in a dark place. But even just the clothing itself, I feel like that's such a strong association. And you have to realize is these movies were released in a time of discrimination and segregation. So during the Great Depression of when Snow White's movie was out, Black men were fired if white men were available to work, which came with the motto, last hired, first fired, for Black men, because if they saw a white man who was available to work, they would immediately fire any Black man around to make that position available for the white men at their time. And lynchings also surged in 1933, which was before the release of Snow White. And then during 1950s, when Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty came out, that was during the Civil Rights Movement, which is when there was so much segregation where it was literally like blacks not allowed, whites are allowed. And so these movies could reflect this racism, and this racism is being sort of taught in a very subtle way in these movies to children. And you might think that I'm being a little over analytical here and being like, oh, that I don't think kids would really think that from these films. But there's actually a famous psychology experiment in the 1940s, and it's Mommy and Kenneth Clark doll test experiment. And so if you don't know about this or you want to research later, I would highly recommend it. It was famous in child psychology because basically they had a white doll and a black doll, and they would ask white children, who do you think is the good doll? Who do you think is the beautiful doll? And even if it was a black child, they would always pick the white doll. Even a black girl would say that the white doll was good and beautiful, and that the black doll that looks like herself is bad and evil. And so this is just something that was drilled in society at that time. And it literally carried over from like society's point of view to the children films that these kids were watching at that time. And this imagery is not as common in later films, which is why I also argue this point, because when you look at villains later on, they have way more of a color palette. Like they have whites, they have reds, purples, they have more features versus these original trilogy of villains were literally just black. And the settings also had very little detail, which kind of made it hard in some scenes to watch, even for me as a child, because it was so dark. And so now we're going into the big explosion of Disney princess era, which is the Disney Renaissance, which is when Disney had just this giant comeback, and it's from 1889 to 1999. And so just a little bit about the 1980s and 1990s. This is when there was the women's movement. And so there was the Equal Rights Amendment that passed, where the Supreme Court ruled that it's just unconstitutional to remove women from the draft. Like, they also have an equal place basically in the military, like they can get drafted as well. And they also banned sex discrimination in all male groups and workplaces, because there was a lot of groups that were like, we're all male only, women can't join. And so this was finally when women can join those groups too. They can join those sports teams, they can join those clubs in those more elitist areas. We also have Dr. Sally K. Rudd, who was the first woman to be sent to space, which is a huge accomplishment in itself. Women are fighting for pro-abortion rights. This was the biggest movement. This is when Planned Parenthood was basically on the rise, and they were alongside there and trying to make it so that women could have more rights over their body. And then there was also the Violence Against Women Act, which funded services for survivors of rape and domestic violence. And women can finally sue their attackers, because in the past, if a woman tried to go to court for any domestic violence or anything like that, she was most of the time blamed for it, and she would receive the negative consequences and punishments. And this is the first time when a woman can actually go to court and actually look their transgressors in the eye and actually sue them for what they did. And then women were actually stepping into the politics scene. So we have Madeleine Albright, who was the first Secretary of State. And then alongside that, which wasn't as big as the women's movement, but we also have the environmental movement, which is when there was a bunch of grievances against trash management, and people really wanted to push for the preservation of nature. And that's when Earth First was created, which was a very active group at that time. And we also have the Redwood Summer protests, where they condemn logging of redwood trees. Redwood trees, if anyone knows, it's Pocahontas. So that's a little spoiler for you. But basically, there's a new way to make money with a whole new world. I thought this was funny. Ariel, listen to me. The human world is a mess. But basically, the original Disney princess model, that's outdated. If they released that in this time period when women are actively and trying to fight, they would actively rip that movie. They would not share it with their children, because women are literally trying to actively fight against those traditional roles. So that would do nothing for them. Let's see. And then Disney decided to create a new collection of princesses to revive interest in the Disney Corporation, which is why this is the Renaissance, because Disney was kind of going in a blip period, and they weren't releasing really good movies that were bringing hauls of money like they wanted. And so they wanted to represent diverse cultures compared to their white predecessors that were more rebellious and independent. And they also created more nature-focused princesses with environmental concerns, for example, like Pocahontas and Ariel. Let's see, I think my screen froze. Okay, so we have our first princess for this great revival, which was Ariel from Little Mermaid, and that came out in 1989. And so Ariel is interesting as a character because she is that like medium between traditional and the current princesses we have now. She still falls in love with the prince and gets married at the end. And she is mute for most of the movies, so he technically does fall in love with her beauty because she didn't really have much to say to him to make him want to fall in love with her. But she is the first princess to be shown practically naked. Like, she had her seashell bra, but she was like naked from the waist down. And you have to understand, that is a huge deal because all the princesses before were always like fully covered. Even when they were like peasants and cleaning their houses, or when Cinderella had that ripped dress scene, she still had her undergarments underneath, which I thought was funny. So this is a huge deal to have a child movie with a princess character that is practically naked. And so it's a great symbol of embracing the freedom of the female body for a new identity, which is also a trope in a lot of classic feminist literature, like The Awakening by Kate Chopin. If you haven't read that book, I'd highly recommend it. And in that novel, well, I don't want to do a spoiler of the book, but basically at some point the protagonist does go into the water fully naked, similar to how Ariel comes from the water fully naked. And so it's more of this trope of, this is my body, I love my body, I can choose to represent it if I want, because society is always trying to restrict it and hide it, which is great for the pro-abortion rights at that time. And she also did not follow her father's will and instead followed hers. She was defiant of the expectations of her society at Atlantis, which was to get married to a merman, and basically just stay within the castle with all her little sisters and sing and do little shows with Sebastian. And she fought for her right to love and for her own happiness at the end. She took an independent action that led to good outcomes. Like, she went to go see Ursula without her father knowing. She made a deal herself, even though there was some mishaps along the way, and she kind of had to get a little help and a little bit of like saving, but I mean, she did actually have a good ending at the end. And it's not like she fell asleep forever and needed Prince Eric to kiss her. And she is the first film where a princess is not cleaning. She had never cleaned anything. She actually was a clutterer. She had like all her knickknacks and everything. She had a plenty in there. And so this is very interesting to see a film where a princess is not doing a domestic task and she's actually interested in being educated. She's always asking questions, always trying to learn, even when people may not teach her or want to teach her. They may teach her incorrectly with Scuttle, but she is actively wanting to learn more and she doesn't want to be stuck in ignorance, which is really powerful message. And so now we're going into Belle from the film Beauty and the Beast in 1991. And so, again, similar to Ariel, she does fall in love with the prince and gets married in the end. But this time, the prince does not fall in love with her for her beauty at first, which is definitely a step up from Ariel. The Beast didn't want her there. Like, he literally put her in a dungeon and was like, I don't want this girl here. But he actually fell in love with her personality and, like, her caring nature, which is the first time that a prince ever did that. Like, they actually had dialogue exchange. This is wild, guys. Like, the prince and the princess actually talked to each other, and then they fell in love. Like, this is mind-boggling. So even after marriage, some people say that she's trapped, and they give Belle a lot of criticism for that. But in my opinion, I don't think she's trapped. I think she actually does live her dreams in the castle, because in the second movie, she does mention that she has adventures and that it's much more interesting than reading the stories in her own home. So I don't view her as a damsel in distress, still stuck against her will in the Beast Castle. Like, I think she genuinely enjoys that life of being in the castle, but not in a restricted way, where she still goes out and has adventures and still reads. And she's defiant of the expectations of her society, because as the intro goes, if you remember the intro song, as Belle goes through the village, everyone's telling her that she should just get married, that she's beautiful, they don't understand, she's strange, she wants to actually read. And so she didn't care. Like, she wanted to be educated. She wanted to actually fall in love and have her own story. And she was defiant of the expectations of having this domestic life and just staying in motherhood. And she fought for her right to love the Beast. Like, she went against her entire society to prove that he was a good individual. And this is the first film where a princess is actually valued for her intellect and education. So that's a big milestone, where she actually received a happy ending from actively reading and asking questions and having curiosity. And so now we're going to go to Jasmine, who's from the film Aladdin in 1992. And so she is the first non-Western princess. So that's a big deal, because every princess before her was white. And she also does not marry a prince, or in this cultural context, the correct term is sultan. And she is defiant of the expectations of her society, because she doesn't. Like, the fact that she is just a POC character and she doesn't marry a prince, like that's already a big deal in the film franchise. And she's rebellious. She escaped the palace walls. She refused to be sheltered. She wanted to make her own life decisions, which is what was some of the tension between her and her father, because he kept bringing suitors in for her to marry, and she just did not want that livelihood. And she also questions the authority of men directly. So, for example, she yelled at the guards when she gave the child an apple, even though they were going to cut off her hands. And she was also skeptical of Prince Ali, until she realized that it potentially could be Aladdin. And she was always like, I don't know about him, instead of just immediately like falling in love with him because he was a prince. The one caveat is that she doesn't move to a whole new world like Ariel and Belle. They completely leave A to go to Z. Ariel left Atlantis to go to the human world. Belle left the little town to go to the castle. Jasmine stays exactly where she is. And she still has a palace at the end, but she does kind of reform the structure and the culture of that palace by marrying Aladdin, so you could argue that. I would like her to go on more adventures, though. They have the other films and like TV series, but she kind of more stays in the palace. But the biggest thing about Aladdin is that the good characters of the film had American accents and white features, while everything that was bad had a accent, and they had like dark features and stereotypical features. And also the Arabic shown in the film was gibberish. So there was kind of like, even though she's a non-Western princess, there was very little like respect to actually representing that culture properly in this film. Especially when the characters that were supposed to look like that culture were all the bad guys, and then all the good guys were super Americanized and Westernized. So not okay. And she was also overly sexualized in that film. She has this huge exotic trope to her, which is even seen in the scene right here where she kisses Jafar and seduces him to help Aladdin get the lamp. Hold on, there's a lot of questions. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, the chat went away. Oh, there it is. Oh, okay. I thought there was a question that y'all weren't seeing my slides for a second. Can you still see it? Okay, sorry about that. Ariel, can you still see the slides? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why. I was like, wait, did it go away? Okay. And then another thing too, she shows her midriff, which is not okay for that culture, mind you, which is very covering. So also not okay to show a non-Western princess and immediately put her in this exotic light and sexualize her. So as you can imagine, people from that similar culture and girls with that similar identity are just having their identity basically sexualized in this way. Not okay, Disney. And so our next one is Pocahontas from the film Pocahontas in 1995. So I'm going to say some goods about the film, also some bads, because we know there's a controversy with this film. So Pocahontas, she's defiant of the expectations of her society. She's an activist, and she puts her life on the line to stand up to the hatred around her. Extremely powerful message. And her whole film shows how differences can exist and still be harmonious. For example, like her culture and her identity strongly contrast those of John Smith, but at the end of the film, there's still love that can grow between them, and there shows that there can be a common understanding. And so it's showing that it's okay to be different and we can still coexist. There does not need to be this division. And it teaches lessons about respecting nature, which is like a beautiful message because that's not really common in children's film. And she's the first princess film to have this interracial romance. So this allows girls to see that they don't need to love a guy from a similar culture as themselves. They can be a completely different skin color, and there's still love that can be developed between that, what I think is a very beautiful message. But this is still very problematic because of the real history behind Pocahontas. Like, should have been another. I think these messages are very beautiful, but they should have done a like original character, not Native American. Just something different. Like, this is not the good context to have this story in, because it's super problematic. Like, let's be real, Pocahontas and her villagers were just mistreated under these colonists. They were just like, Native Americans were just treated so horribly in history, and this just romanticizes it and glorifies it and just kind of erases history of what genuinely happened. And the real Pocahontas was forcefully married. There was no love. She was just taken away from her family to go to England. And just this abuse is glamorized in Disney's eyes, and just hiding the real story. And so I put the real picture of Pocahontas just to like respect her and show this is what she looked like. The movie, she looks so sexualized as well. Again, another non-Western princess being sexualized in her film. She has very short dress. She's just like showing off a lot of skin, but as you can see in Pocahontas's image, she was more covered than that. And also just her features looked Western. She had like big lips. She just looked like a Barbie. I don't know. That's what I thought as a child. Like, I thought she looked kind of off. And so it was a little, it's not okay. She was whitewashed and unauthentic, and it's kind of disheartening, sharing this message to children that like, oh, Native Americans were in love when people came over and took their land. And it's similar to Thanksgiving where the kids dress up and hold hands and they're like, we had a great big dinner and we didn't do anything wrong, because, you know, that's not true. Let's not raise them in ignorance. Let's tell them what really happened. And you know what? That can make them active members in the community when they're older, to reach out and not repeat the mistakes of history, and to respect this culture in an appropriate way. And so now we're going to go to Mulan, which is from the film Mulan that came out in 1998. So Mulan, I love Mulan, sorry, put my personal statement in there, but she's defiant of the expectations of her society, which is China. She does not find love or marriage as expected in the beginning of the film, which I really like that contrast trope where she was all dolled up, getting trained to get into marriage and being this perfect wife that her society like deems and values. And then she completely just defies that throughout the film. And with the ending, she doesn't get married or anything, which is like amazing in itself. She had a male alter ego named Ping, and she left behind this feminine identity to pursue this one. And then she returned to this feminine identity after the ending of the war. But I don't look at that as her going backwards. I think that the ending is personally extremely open-minded. Mulan received respect instead of ridicule for having both identities. She wasn't just praised for being Ping, she was praised for being Mulan, which is powerful in itself. Like, the emperor allows Mulan to sit in the imperial council. When she goes to her father and she shows Shun Yu's, sorry if I butcher the names, I apologize for that, but when she shows the sword and the emperor's medal, her father literally just puts that aside and hugs Mulan herself. Like, he didn't care about the status and the honor that she brought, which is a huge part of this culture. He loved her for who she is, and I think that's an extremely powerful message. It also reveals an openness to change in traditional customs. She didn't follow, again, these standards and have this happy ending with a marriage. This is the first film where a princess takes an active role in battle. Like, Pocahontas, like, she stops the battle, everyone kind of helps a little bit, and the prince does everything, but she was like all up in there and she was fighting in the battle as an equal. Fun fact, she actually killed more people in this movie than any other Disney character that existed. That's how, like, seriously cool Mulan is. And so the lesson from Mulan is that I feel like gender roles do not define who she is as a person, and what her place is and her potential. And I think just this playing of gender roles and these stereotypes associated with feminine and masculine, I think that was very personally well played, and I think it's very refreshing to see for children to have a model that doesn't follow exact feminine standards of beauty and I wear pretty dresses and then I get married and fall in love. Like, she actually like chopped off her hair and was battling and holding a sword. So this success of these films launched the Disney Princess franchise officially in Disney. It didn't exist before the Disney Renaissance, even though there was Snow White, Cinderella, and Aurora. And launched in the 1990s. It was made up of characters that are royal by birth, royal by marriage, or have a status in their country and region because, for example, like Pocahontas is not a princess. She's a chief's daughter. And so it was created mostly because Disney was dropping in sales. Andy Mooney, he saw the potential after he went to the store and literally saw girls wearing generic princess outfits, and he's like, I bet I could sell that too with our Disney princesses because we have so many and our films are successful. And so this is how successful the franchise is. Consumer products rose from 300 million to 3 billion in 5 years. Like, that's how much revenue was pumped by like consumers. Everyone was buying everything Disney princess. If you were alive during this time, like, everything was Disney princess, like backpacks. It was a huge deal. And with the Renaissance princesses, minorities actually finally had a role model to admire that they can relate to, versus beforehand with Snow White, Cinderella, and Aurora. They were all Western-based princesses, but now we have like Mulan and Jasmine. But again, the characterization of these were very oversimplified, whitewashed, stereotype. It kind of weakens the strength of these characters and what they potentially could have, which I think, going ahead of myself, the newer princesses launched now, like Moana, they kind of step up to the plate a little bit more in that regards. But the thing is that even though they finally have these diverse princesses, Pocahontas and Mulan were rarely depicted on princess merchandise during that time. They are a little bit more now. Still not as common as the other ones, but when this franchise came out, they were barely present. So it's like they had these diverse characters, but didn't want to actually market and put them alongside their white counterparts. And when they do have Mulan, they have her in that traditional clothing, and which she was miserable but wearing in the film. And not much of her and her Ping identity or her warrior getup, which is very sad that they kind of just marketed and sold her in that regards when they did finally have products of her. So it seems as though Disney wants diversity, but is hesitant to have them side by side with the other white princesses. And so now we're going into the early revival era, which is from 2008 to 2009. So a little bit about the early 2000s. During the 1990s and the early 2000s, the Black film boomed. Most media in the Black film boom were in urban settings, and they focused on the struggle of violence, discrimination, and frustration of these communities. So there's movies like Barbershop, All About the Benjamins. Halle Berry was the first African-American female to win an Academy Award for Best Actress. And all states finally recognized Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day as an official holiday in 2000. Unfortunately, Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana and southern Mississippi, devastating New Orleans. More than 800,000 housing units were destroyed, which is where Princess and the Frog takes place, and why there was some potential backlash to that film with that setting because of Hurricane Katrina. In 2009, Barack Obama was inaugurated as the first African-American president of the United States, and Michelle Obama was the first African-American First Lady of the U.S. So as you can see, there was this giant movement and finally recognition of Black people in film, now in politics, which is why this leads up to Princess Tiana from The Princess and the Frog in the film that came out in 2009. And so a little bit about Tiana. She is the first Black Disney princess. She's not a damsel in distress. She saves the prince, actually, and destroys, I can't say his name, I'm so sorry, but she destroys the villain's talisman herself instead of having the prince battle the villain directly, which is so interesting in itself. Like, he did not really do anything. She's the one that saved him, which I appreciate. one fun fact about her, which I felt like was such a missing moment about the film, she's the only princess to not have her hair be seen loose in her film. And personally, so for that, that might seem like a small detail, but I felt like that could have been used for the love of black hair. Like, I felt like that was such a good moment for that, to just have her natural hair come down. The fact that it was always in a bun, I felt just like suppressed that black female identity personally. I loved her original concept art. I would definitely look into it if you're interested. And she had such beautiful black hair. I really loved it, like having that texture, having some diversity, allowing black girls to finally love their hair. I felt like that was a good moment for that, and I just felt like it was just suppressed with that bun that she always had. Um, and she was the first princess to be turned into an animal, which again really weakened her character. When she is human, she was judged by her appearance throughout the film. She was even told by a real estate broker that a woman of her background shouldn't dream so big. And so it's like she is an animal the whole time, and then when she is a human, she's dealing with some backlash from society, and I felt like that's just showing a very negative association with the black identity, and I just was not really for that. I just felt like it weakened her. Black girls could not see a character as themselves throughout the entire film. They just had to go and make her a frog, and I don't, like, what message are you telling them? And then there's this character named Lottie, which is down here in the corner. She's a foil to Tiana, and I love her and I hate her, okay? I like her being a foil is a very strong artistic approach of Disney criticizing their old Disney ways of having a white character in Pursuit of Marriage, extremely feminine, and how it contrasts Tiana, who is down to earth, hardworking, and who is just a good role model, and how you don't need to be that old way to be like awesome. And I really liked her in that regards. But then I think they overplayed Lottie in the movie and had her have too much of an influence where it took away from Tiana's independence. And that's where I kind of am like, I don't really like Lottie in that regards, because this is why. Tiana and her mother are indentured servants to Lottie and her white family. Again, a little bit insensitive to just cultural context of the black identity. She receives her happily ever after only when Lottie helps pay for her restaurant. And she did not, Tiana didn't accomplish her dreams herself, but she needed this white counterpart to kind of help give her those stepping stones. And I felt like that was a little bit insensitive in that regards, with, again, the black identity having to depend on their white counterparts to advance themselves in society. And I just felt like that wasn't a good message. I don't think Lottie should have played as much of a role towards the ending in that regards. I think it was good for the beginning, but I don't know, I'd rather see Tiana just live it up herself and take on with her own strength, which they did with her just defeating the villain, but still, that financial gain and everything, her being an indentured servant, that didn't really sit well with me. And then Tiana is overworked and underpaid in a society that doesn't value her until she becomes a princess in the end. She just had to deal with so many struggles, but then at the end, everyone like kind of was more, thought she was like amazing or anything, and I just, I don't know. But I still love Tiana for her cultural impact and allowing finally black girls to grow up with a princess that looked like them. I just think there's some areas of it that Disney should have thought about more before incorporating it in the film. And we're almost there. So even with the progressive evolution in these role models in the Disney Princess franchise, there's obviously still some flaws in these characters and their cultural portrayals. And most of these fairy tales do come from a European descent, which could explain the rigid roles of these women, especially in the older princesses like Snow White, Cinderella, and Aurora. And even though there is no direct research study, because I have looked into this numerous times, saying that playing princess damages self-esteem or anything, there are research studies, though, that explain how young women who hold these traditional beliefs are more likely to be depressed and put pressure on themselves to be perfect, which is a study, Orenston 2015, you can look it up as well. And these Disney princesses are the poster children for this femininity. So we are feeding this type of ideology to our girls, and we need to be more mindful of that. And whether or not Disney has a negative influence, again, I feel like depends on the parents. So I feel like if parents teach their children about these films and their cultural, historical inaccuracies, don't let them fall into the tropes that the movies are trying to teach them, but teach them ideas that sometimes contrast, especially the earlier films like Snow White, like, oh, you don't need to be the only one that cleans. You don't need to just marry and fall in love and wait for Prince Charming. I think it would spare them being ignorant from like the reality when they grow up. And I think it's just something that parents might be mindful, because again, we might think like, oh, these are just films, kids aren't going to adapt this. But if you actually study child development, this early time in their childhood is what molds their identity as people. They're super influenced by everything that goes on around them, by the authority figures in their life, like their parents, their guardians, the consumer culture, what they're watching. That idea is what's feeding into them, because they're like basically like a sponge at this point. And so you can see that again with that doll experiment. Like there's Black girls who thought that Black was bad and evil and ugly, just because that's what was being around them in the media and what adults were telling them and everything like that. And so the more modern Disney princesses do teach more liberating morals and self-expression, which is the revival era, which is 2010 and present, where we have like Moana, we have Merida, we have the Frozen sisters, we have our first Latina princess. It's a great time. There's Sophia the First. So I'm not going to go into that with this topic because almost running out of time. But if you would like a presentation on the new princesses and going into that, diving into that, I can do that as well. And also a topic I would bounce off of that is it's interesting because our Disney media right now is super diverse, but that diversity does not translate to the parks. So they still have white people playing Moana instead of a person who should play that role. So there is definitely a disconnect between media and what Disney is putting out in their character performers. So that's also an interesting topic. And then other characters that were considered for Disney Princess franchise, if you guys want a dive into that, there was Tinkerbell, Alice, Esmeralda, there was Meg, there was Jane from Tarzan, there's Giselle from Enchanted. So let me know, guys. So thank you for coming. Sorry for the whole weird beginning part with the inappropriateness that happened, but thank you for watching. And if you have any questions, we can discuss that now. We can talk for however long you like. You can contact me at the Heroes for Hire 001 at outlook.com email. Follow our page on Facebook, follow my personal page on Facebook. If you do have questions, like some people have already reached out to me and asked for my sources for this presentation, I'll be glad to send that over. There is actually some really interesting books about just the economics of Disney, just the way they portray things, the history of Disney. So let me know. And for all you guys who are curious, I nailed it with my essay for my graduation requirement. And I finally proved that Disney Princess can be academic worthy literature. So huge accomplishment there. So I'm glad to take any questions and read the chat and stuff. So you can feel free to unmute yourself if you have a particular question. Let's see. Oh, there's a lot here. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you use to do your research? Was this like published articles or watching movies yourself and analyzing, or like how did you do this essay?
Okay, yes. So that's a good question. So there is actual books that have analyzed Disney films. So some of it was like my original commentary, or some people like analyzed like this is the color scheme of all these different films. And then I also did my own history research of that time period. But there is academic literature on Disney itself, like its cultural impact, what those characters portray to others. And there was that research study that I talked about in the beginning, where they were studying the themes. That research study is what inspired me to go more into my hardcore research, because that was published like actual academic research where they analyzed like scene by scene 26 Disney films, and noticed those themes. And I thought it would be interesting to dive more into that in regards to the Disney Princess franchise. But yes, there is actual like academic, like more like sociologists or psychologists, like they sit there and think about child development and things like that. I like doing that myself personally. One topic I'm like interested in right now that I'm researching is like how the pleasure principle and the need for instant gratification is developing in children now. And I believe personally is due to like technology, like with tablets for children, but also LOL surprise dolls and toy opening videos on YouTube. I think that's also going into that. So what I would do for that type of research is I would read like how common these cultural phenomena are, like how much like money, how much people like buy those products, how widespread is it, and then look at like whether or not like children are having a harder time being more patient. And there's research study that, and you can sometimes make connections in that way.
Yeah. When I was a freshman in college for a creative writing class, I did like a research paper, except I forget exactly what I used on race in Disney, like racial stereotypes. So I focused a lot on older movies like Dumbo, Song of the South, Peter Pan, and a few others. But I forget if I mentioned this, but I know you talked especially about like the non-Western princesses, and I felt like that's a very important thing to bring up, because to be honest, like when I was a kid, like I didn't really know much about like China or the Middle East aside from like seeing Aladdin or Mulan. So I know that they're very like Western perspectives of like, you know, cultures like that. But it's like that's kind of how I grew up, like knowing like about Chinese culture, for example, because of like Mulan, and that was like my only exposure until like, you know, I got older.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's why like these films are really important for people to step back and look at it. It's really important to look at it and be like, what is this film saying about these identities, whether it's cultural or female or male identity? What are the messages it's trying to convey? And I think a harder question is, what is it saying about other people? Because sometimes that's the harder part for people to do. Like they're like, okay, like Pocahontas is saying like, oh, love John Smith, I can love him even though we're interracial, but like it's different to know how people who are Native American would feel about the film and whether or not the Native American culture is being portrayed accurately. And I think that is harder to do, which is why people don't do it, but it's really important to do, because you don't want your kids to kind of feed into this and think this is okay, because then when they finally meet children from those cultures, they're going to assume like that's the right path, like because Disney told me and I follow Disney and I love Disney and I have this Jasmine doll and everything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like some arguments people have is like, which I don't think is valid, is they're like, well, it's oversimplified because kids can't understand.
Oh, I hate
And
that.
I personally hate that argument. I think children can understand. You just need to take the time to explain it until they can understand. And I think that's the issue. People don't have that patience. And I think to simplify it by making it American, that just shows like this egotistical standard we have in America, where we're like think simplified is putting it in our context.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because like you don't have to, like you can put it in the simpler parts of their culture, maybe not go into depth about every little thing, but like at least portray it accurately.
And yeah, with the Disney parks as well, like I was hearing that from some people, especially I have some friends besides you who are character performers, and I didn't really know about like the whitewashing, I guess, or like having white people even play like the non-Western princesses. So like I guess like what's your take on that, or how much do you know about that?
It's pretty bad. Actually, during the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a giant petition circulating online. I feel like I should find it and post it for people to sign it. But it was basically talking about that, like how people who play Jasmine tend to be white, people who play Moana tend to be white. Um, Even people who play Mulan sometimes are not even Asian at all, which is just mind boggles me. And so I don't think that's okay. A lot of people try to throw justification like, oh, it's hard to find people to represent that culture. Like, okay, maybe it's hard to find a Pacific Islander to play Moana, which I don't think it is because they found an actress to voice her in the movie. Like, there's people out there, they make it seem like they just don't want to do anything with their lives, but they then at least find someone with that skin color because that makes a difference. Like, these role models are what these girls look up to. They finally have someone that looks like them, and then just whitewashing when they meet them in real life, that's just again reminds them you don't have anyone who looks like you that you can look up to. I think it's ridiculous. And so the biggest argument I see is that it's hard to find BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color, in performance and theater, which is the biggest hogwash I've ever heard. Just look at Hamilton, like, and everything. Like, they're out there. It's just people don't want to represent them,
Yeah.
and they choose not to cast them. That's the real deal, and I think it's problematic. And more people should fight Disney for that because
Yeah.
I went to go see Disney on Ice, and I was so excited for this Disney on Ice show because it was travel around the world, so it's supposed to be diverse cultures, and it was supposed to have Aladdin, Moana, Lion King. They were literally all white, like, and they brown faced too. Like, literally wore like brown skin suits and brown face paint, and it was like so disheartening that they literally had these white people represent these cultures around the world and didn't have one person to accurately portray that. And I was personally mad. You can hear me screaming in the videos. I was like, ah! But yeah, I was really mad at that.
I feel like Disney also has a history of that too, because like for example, even like for example, Variety, It's a Small World, which was made for like the 1964 World
Mm-hmm.
Fair, I believe. Like that, even though like you know it's supposed to portray different cultures, but I feel like a lot of it is just Western stereotypes. So for example, when you see like the Japanese people singing their portion of the song, they're just like bowing, or when you see Indian people, they're like playing like the flute with the snake. I don't know what it's called.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
it doesn't hurt to like reach out to these communities and ask them and get them involved in the process.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's also a big disconnect. Like, okay, like when they made like Aladdin, right? Maybe
Yeah.
they don't know Arabic. Like, no one in the studio knows Arabic. Okay,
Yeah.
it's not that hard to find someone. Don't just write random squiggles everywhere and be like, this is Arabic, guys. Like, really? It's just offensive to the people that are from that culture because it's just saying, well, we think your language is just a bunch of scribbles on a piece of paper, and we think your dark features are villains, and it's hilarious to use that as a trope of comedy throughout our film.
Hmm. Thanks for answering my questions and
Oh yeah,
hosting this
no
panel.
problem. Oh yeah, no problem. Some said, I'm like, if people like it, I can talk about other things like in the future if you want to hear like the new Princess revival and everything.
Sorry, I was ignoring the entire presentation to play Vocaloid, but no, I'm joking.
I was so mad at you. I was like, Ari.
No, but I actually put a link because you were talking about some articles. There is this Transformative Works website, which I like because it's a lot of free articles, or not a lot. It's all free and accessible, but it's like a lot of like peer-reviewed and scholarly articles on like a lot of different topics. So I just typed in Disney Princess, and that's the search results that came up.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you want to take that site down. Sometimes I just go through there when I'm looking for a fun read.
Yeah, I'll definitely. All about that life. Yeah, I'm that person that I love things, but then I like psychoanalyze everything.
No, I feel my dude.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions? Or anyone want to share experiences? It's okay. Because this is like the 90s, the Renaissance era. That was most of our era. So if anyone wants to share that. But yeah, I was actually horrified when I was like in middle school, I think, and I found the um, autobiography of Pocahontas because I was expecting it to be like the Disney film, and I was so horrified when I actually read it and like read her story, and I felt like so sad for her. Like it was the biggest mind-boggling thing to me because I really love Pocahontas dearly because I just love her as a character. I love the soundtrack and everything, and it just is so, it's just so messed up that her real life is not as romantic and beautiful as like the film portrayed it. Any other questions?
Have you analyzed at all how the Disney films correlate to like the original fairy tales?
I have actually a little bit, not fully in depth, but I have done some for like The Little Mermaid, The Legend of Fa Mulan, some of them like the Snow Queen and things like that. If that's of an interest, I can do that as well. Yeah, because it is different. Ariel's ending is very sad and tragic. She gave up everything for the prince, and he goes with another woman. So sad. And her existence is just painful too. Anything else?
I don't have any questions. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Speak now, forever hold your peace, yo. Let's see. I'm trying to go through the comments. I was legally required to watch The Little Mermaid. What is that, Ari?
I had to do it to get my license to use my name.
Oh my gosh. I got it. I was like, what?
Okay, that's actually like one of my pet peeves. Since I was little, every time I would say Ariel and they'd be like, what? And I'd be like, Ariel. And they're like, what? And I'd be like, The Little Mermaid. And they'd be like, oh, Ariel. Like, not Ariel. Ariel, you fools. You fools.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and then Pocahontas too, though. Oh man, I saw that comment from you, Andrew. That was also Pocahontas too. When she's in England, she finds love again, and it's like, problematic. Okay, well, thank you for everyone who attended the panel. I'm gonna stop going live.